The UK government sets out guidelines that say teachers should insist on the biological sex of their students when it comes to clothing, names, and changing rooms. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is taking a completely different path than our government here in Germany, for example. Teachers in England will strike an unprecedented tone with some students this year. The reason is a new handbook for schools that specifies how teachers should deal with transgender children. Being transgender means that a person does not identify with the biological sex they were assigned at birth. The British Department for Education published the draft of this set of guidelines shortly before Christmas. Teachers should take a very cautious approach when they observe children wanting to socially transition, as the handbook says. Social transition means that a transgender person adapts their appearance according to the gender with which they identify, for example, through clothing or a different name or pronouns. There's also medical transition, which includes taking puberty blockers and gender reassignment surgery. The latter is prohibited for minors in Great Britain. But there are some key points of the new guidebook, and the teachers should inform parents if their child wants to transition socially, and they can also choose not to use the student's preferred name or pronoun. They can also instruct transgender students to wear school uniforms that correspond to their biological sex. Transgender students are also only allowed to use toilets and changing rooms that correspond to their biological gender. The same applies to participation in physical education classes to ensure safety and fairness, as they say. Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch said the guide would give schools more confidence in dealing with an issue that has been hijacked by activists. And Education Minister Gillian Keegan said, "This policy puts the welfare of all children first and removes confusion about the protections that must be provided for biological sex and gender segregated spaces. Parents must be at the center of all decisions affecting their children." This would be particularly true when these decisions could have significant long-term effects on a child's life, according to her. The guidelines apply only to schools in England and are not legally binding. According to the online platform Schools Week, lawyers estimate that those affected could successfully sue schools if they enforce certain guidelines. The Equal Opportunities Act serves as the legal basis here. The Conservative government in Great Britain has placed the debate about trans rights high on its agenda, and this despite the fact that, according to a survey from 2021, only around 0.5% of English people are transgender. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has made no secret of the fact that he does not believe in challenging the male-female binary. "A man is a man and a woman is a woman," that's what he declared in his party conference speech in October. "We cannot be forced to believe that people can live in any gender," he said. A point of view that resonates particularly with socially conservative voters. A few months earlier, Sunak had announced that he would consider a change to Britain's Equality Act that would define gender as purely biological. And the guide for schools fits this picture now. The British Ministry of Education is effectively telling teachers to increasingly monitor students who question their gender identity. Only a few countries in Europe have policies specifically aimed at schools, including Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Malta. In contrast to Great Britain, to the rest of Great Britain, there's a tendency towards more freedom for transgender minors. Right-wing conservative governments in Eastern Europe in particular are watching schools closely. In Hungary, teachers are not allowed to distribute LGBTQI-friendly content, and the recently voted out Polish government planned a similar thing last year. And in Germany too, there is no nationwide catalogue of guidelines for schools. However, the Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency, which reports to the Ministry of Family Affairs, provides direction on its website. And there you can find stuff like online brochures from LGBTQI organizations that inform teachers and students about transgenderism. The educational initiative Queer Format recommends that teachers use a student's desired pronoun. The new self-determination law in Germany sounds similar. Accordingly, minors aged 14 and over are allowed to change their gender entry with the consent of their parents. The law is due to come into force at the end of this year. Reactions to the British draft guidelines were mixed though. The gender-critical group Sex Matters welcomed the new guidelines. No other country that has allowed the trans lobby to determine teaching content and school guidelines has changed course so decisively. That was the praise by Director Maya Forstater. The group is grateful that the government has prioritized the welfare and safety of children rather than giving into ideological anti-science dogma. Whoa. Well, the LGBT organization Mermaids UK, however, described the guide as unpractical, quixotic and absurd. Instead of listening to transgender youth and working with best practices from trained educators, the government created more confusion in schools. The guidelines would also put trans children at risk. According to British media reports, teachers are concerned that students whose parents reject their social transition could experience violence or end up on the streets. And for some right-wing conservative MPs within the governing party, the manual does not even go far enough. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss criticized that guidelines without legal bindings would offer neither sufficient protection nor clarity, and according to the MP, a law is needed for this. According to a report by Politico, Truss is already working on a plan that has the support of far-right party members. As a result, gender-segregated rooms should be protected by law and social transition in schools should be banned. And in addition, minors should be prohibited from taking puberty blockers. The Ministry of Education's catalogue of guidelines will be discussed for 12 weeks. The government is inviting parents, teachers and school leaders to share what they think of the guidelines. And trans children are left out here. But there's also news from Scotland in that direction, because the Scottish government has now declared its plans for a self-determination law in the country to have failed. The dispute between Scotland and the British government is likely to be over for the time being. In December 22, the Scottish Parliament passed a new self-determination law. The core of the project was that young people aged 16 and over and adults without a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria and without mandatory psychological support would be allowed to change gender in an office. And shortly afterwards, in January 23, the British Ministry for Scotland declared its veto. According to Article 35 of the Scottish Autonomy Act, decisions are invalid if they impede or contravene the application of British law. In this specific case, the proposed self-determination law violates the equality guidelines and thus also the rights of women, they say. And the majority of Scots also rejected the law. A strong supporter of the project was then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who resigned a short time later. Her successor, the previous Health Minister and new First Minister Hamza Yusuf, then declared that they wanted to take the veto to court. The legal challenge was launched in September of last year and has now failed because the highest Scottish civil court. The judges declared that the veto from England was legal. Social Affairs Minister Shirley Ann Somerville explained that it was impossible to take legal action against the cancellation from London. One now hopes for a new government in Great Britain under Labour leadership in the future, so that the veto can then be lifted. The proposed law will remain unprocessed in Parliament for as long as possible. And First Minister Yusuf said that would have been a dark day. In return, Scottish Conservatives cheered the end of the Self-Determination Act and once again asserted that the dangerous law belongs in the bin, as they say. The British Minister Alistair Jack, responsible for Scotland, as well as several women's protection associations, also expressly welcomed the decision. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.